We're grateful for you guys making the time to come and spend time with us today, because I know we've got some very busy people in this room and some people that have travelled quite a way to be here as well, so appreciate that. Thank you very much. We're not expecting a fire alarm or a test or anything today, so if the fire alarm goes off we will be leaving the building. We need to be going down the stairs and to your left, and the fire exit is literally on that side of the wall. The toilets are underneath us here, so down the stairs and follow yourself back round through the kitchen, and the toilets are just in that area there. Food and drinks are here for you, please just enjoy it as you want. This is going to be run as a very relaxed sort of informal chat. There's going to be a conversation to start with and a Q&A, but do feel that you can move around, get a drink and something to eat if you wish. There are going to be a few people arriving as we kick this off as well, so we'll try and make that as uneventful as possible, but we'll just be bringing some extra guests in that have been slightly delayed. So that's it from me. I'd like to introduce you now to Pirate FM and UKRD Group's Head of News, Tristan Hunkin, who's going to be leading us through the biggest life story. I wrote this down, I want to get this right. This is technically true, the biggest life story we've ever had the opportunity to experience in the history of Pirate FM in this building, so no pressure there, Tristan. Thank you very much.
We already know it's going to be a good life story because it is the story of a man who knows where to stand near the buffet table as well. So absolutely right. So my guest this lunchtime is a former Lieutenant Commander in the South African Navy who wanted to be, I think it was a naval chaplain, didn't you? But there wasn't a vacancy at the time. So after a security breach at a place called Robben Island, he was asked to become a prison chaplain instead. And Colin Chambers went on to form a close relationship with a number of people on that prison island, including one man named Nelson Mandela. So over 8 years he went on to become a pastor, a confidant and a friend of Nelson Mandela, and to become one of the very few people who had access during that time to the future president. So come and take a seat. Thank you. And start off by fleshing out that a little bit. So how did you end up having this extraordinarily close relationship with Nelson Mandela?
Well, it's really interesting because, as you said quite correctly, I really wanted to be a chaplain in the South African Navy. I loved the Navy, and I thought, well, I can wear the uniform, I can preach the gospel, fire the guns, captain the ship. In my mind, I think I was too big for God. And they said, well, would I, they didn't have a vacancy, I'd be a prison chaplain at Polesmoor Prison, which is that big 6,000 man prison and woman prison in Cape Town. And then, as you said, and without repeating, it was a security breach from the former chaplain. And I think the authorities, because South Africa was so rigidly security controlled, they thought maybe a person that's a signatory to the Official Secrets Act, and that would be a good bet to go there. So, and the whole Robben Island thing came. They said, you know, would you do it if they would receive you? Well, there were 432 prisoners there, so obviously they didn't have a referendum amongst 432. So they took me to the senior group. Some of the names are assigned in that Bible of mine there. And when I went across on the ferry, I'd say in fear and trepidation. There was no fear because I thought, well, if they don't want me there, it's been a nice fun trip to Robben Island across Table Bay. But I went into that room and I recognised Walter Sisulu, but this enormous big man at the time nearly crushed bones in my hand, and just said to me, the name's Mandela, you're very welcome. No, Mandela welcomed you, you're welcome. All 432 would go along because he was the sort of leader figure on the island. And then he said to me, you're very welcome. How was the trip over? And it was the third one, I can't remember. And how's your father? And I thought, Dad's fine. But bear in mind, he was almost the same age as my late father. But it was not connected with how's my father. It was when I was in South Africa 2 years ago, and it was after his death. I was driving up in an old car I keep there to Heeltown, the Methodist Missionary School, where he was educated. And there was a lady teaching Xhosa on the radio, that was Mandela's language. And I was riveted to the seat when she said, if a leading Xhosa tribal member asks you, how's your father? It's a sign that you've been accepted. Now, I was so sorry I didn't know that at the time, but that was basically how the friendship and relationship started.
Talk to me about going on to the island, because we talk about this prison island. What were the conditions like in it?
Well, you can divide it in half. The first 14 years, they were absolutely diabolical. There's no other way of putting it. They slept on a mat on the floor about that thick. And apartheid was, no white prisoners were ever held on Robben Island, but in apartheid days, it was whites and non-whites. And non-whites were Africans, mixed race, Filipinos, Japanese, Chinese, South Americans, anyone who wasn't pure Caucasian white. And even apartheid was rigidly enforced on the island. If you were African, you had a canvas jacket. If you were any of the other categories except white, because they weren't on the island, you could have a jumper. The African ones had short trousers and no underwear. Don't ask me why there no underwear, I never asked that question. But if you were any other category of non-white, you could have long trousers. And even to the level, because I think this is quite interesting, even to the level of if you were a non-white but not African non-white, you had 6 ounces of meat when the meat rations were. But if you were an African, you had 5 ounces of meat. And what's an ounce? About the weight of mine. And the conditions, sleeping on the mats on the floor, the cells then, I'll answer your question fully if I'm not going too much on a tangent. The cells then were the communal cells, but the leaders each had their individual cell, locked up at 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the afternoon. That was for staff things. But all they had was this mat and blankets, and a tin mug and a tin plate, no utensils to eat with. You either eat with your hands or drink it, and a kind of rubbish bin about so high. I've got pictures, but obviously not for this one. And that was the ablution facilities for because they were in there from 4 o'clock to 5:30 the next morning. And the first job in the morning at 5:30 was they had to clean these ablution bins, or whatever you can call it. And interestingly, that was the one time, because in those first years, they were never allowed to talk to themselves without a warder in earshot. And it was the one time, for obvious reasons, the warders held back a little bit. And so they did discuss a bit there. After 78, at the insistence of Mandela, and people like Helen Suzman had visited the island, and I think they allowed photographs to come. Only one was the Daily Telegraph were allowed to take a few pictures, and they dressed Mandela up, and he was the one time in that picture you saw, when you saw Mandela angry, his mouth went like a U, upside down, and he refused to be dressed in decent looking clothes unless Walter Sisulu was dressed similarly, so they dressed Walter Sisulu similarly. But conditions did improve. They got basic beds, they were allowed little cardboard bookcases, and they were allowed a few books. So conditions did change, but they were diabolical. Sorry, is that too full an answer?
No. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and they did hard labour. It was in a limestone quarry on the Cape Town side of the island, blindingly white. And if you notice afterwards, a lot of the pictures of Mandela and the others, Sisulu and that, you often saw them wearing dark glasses because their eyes were permanently damaged by that. And then those rocks that they got out of there would be brought back to the courtyard, and mindless hard labour would sit with hammers in rows, grinding it to powder in the blazing sun with the armed warders walking around. And some of that gravel was used for the driveways of the wardens' houses, but it was mindless hard labour, and that stopped in about 78 as well. So conditions were pretty diabolical, as I said.
And was that reflective then, what was going on with the prison, with these changes that were happening gradually, reflective of what was going on outside the prison? It was just set in context for us what was happening, because this was the 80s.
Late 70s, 80s. It was a very, very difficult time in South Africa. Unrest was building up. There was pressure from the rest of the world. There was President P.W. Botha, known as the Groot Crocodile, the great crocodile, literally translated. Kragdadig, that means intransigent in Afrikaans. And P.W. Botha could never bring himself to the point of talking to Mandela. It was that bridge too far. And so the country was boiling. Mandela became the kind of figurehead, although a lot of people didn't know what he even looked like. There was slight, so they thought, well, if they made the prison conditions a bit easier, it might buy a bit more time, if I could use that expression. I think that's probably the best way of putting it.
And it's fascinating to think, isn't it, that, as you say, people didn't know what he looked like, whereas, you know, you see a picture now, he's probably one of the few instantly recognisable people around the world.
Yes. Well, I didn't know what he looked like when I went in. I didn't recognise him when I went into that room. You know, he came and said, "The name's Mandela." Wow, you know, the world's talking about you.
So the name was more recognisable
than the face, yes.
And he's clearly now got a reputation as a great leader of people. Was that the case from what you saw in jail?
Oh, definitely. You know, it's hard to describe. There's certain people in this world, I'm not one of them, when you might all be busy here, but when they come into the room, you're aware that somebody's... He just had that aura about him. And it wasn't a pomposity, if there's such a word. It wasn't "I'm the greatest," because he had this incredible way of mixing with urchin children and meeting with Queen Elizabeth, who he always called Liz, by the way, and being the same person. And he loved children, and sorry, I'm detailing, but he loved the Spice Girls. That was one of his favourite groups. I think he liked to do the Mandela Jive. I don't know if Posh joined him on the Mandela Jive. But, you know, he was such a people's person, yet he had this aura, to answer your question. So he was the undisputed leader on the island.
And does history recount how the Queen felt about being interested in this? I'll go off on a tangent.
I don't think she would ever say that. And there's one time when he came over to London and saw the Queen, and Zelda Lagrange apparently says it did happen. She was his white PA. And, you know, people say, well, it's folklore, you'd have to phone Buckingham Palace and ask them. But apparently he did say, "Liz, it's so wonderful to see you again. I'm so glad you put on a bit of weight since we last met." He was the type of person, I believe it was true, but that would get away with a statement like that. I can't imagine any of the prime ministers saying that. Not amused would be. But then, to give credit to Her Majesty, she's a student of the Commonwealth, and I'm sure she would have known that's a tradition to be a bit heavy, that word is a sign of well-being.
Going back to that time in jail then, I know that Archbishop Desmond Tutu has talked about the transformation that occurred for him personally while he was in jail, how he went in and then came out. Did you notice that change over the years that you were talking with him?
Yes. Archbishop Desmond Tutu said on the Saturday after he died on the Thursday night that he went into prison, an angry, violent young man, got converted and came out this icon of peace and reconciliation. That was Archbishop Tutu's exact words. I think the foundations, and if I could just tangent answer the question, but I think the fact that he was educated at a Methodist missionary school, and I think the foundations of forgiveness, and I'm not the only one, because the Daily Mail said on the 2nd of May this year in an article by Dominic Lawson, Nigella's brother, the Daily Mail, that article that I read, there's a little paragraph hidden in that article that said the blessing for white South Africa was that Nelson Mandela went to a Christian school and was taught the value of forgiveness. Okay, so that links up with So it came, I think, in those lonely times in the cell, this whole idea of that violence isn't going to work because violence begets violence. We talked about that sometimes in his mellower moments when we had coffee in his cell. And I think he realized that peace and reconciliation was the only way, but I haven't answered your question yet. I'm quite good at that.
Yes.
I should have been a politician.
Yeah, I'm used to it. Did you threaten to overrule him?
No, there was that. I do remember the question, you see. I've given a good political answer going around the circle and not come to the question. But seriously, there was that steady change and the warming, and he didn't come to me and kneel down and say, you know, pray for me. We did pray together, but I think it was a gradual sort of process, and it became more evident in the times that I was with him, if I could put it that way. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu was probably his closest friend. You know, politicians often have good friends in the political arena, but his first night out of prison was at Desmond and Leah Tutu's house. And so whatever Tutu says about him, you can take as, well, I am a minister, gospel truth.
Yes. And during those conversations then, I guess over 8 years, the topics, what you talked about, ranged pretty wide.
They did, but I'll tell you what, initially they were very superficial, the weather, the state of the sea, because you always had to have a warder in earshot. And I was very aware that I was there by the grace of, you know, not stepping out of line. But when I proved to the authorities, I suppose, trustworthy, if I could say that way, eventually they were in sight but not earshot. And then eventually sometimes they didn't even be near. So the conversations went from superficially to more deeper things like his family, praying for his family. I mean, he lost one of his sons when he was in prison. I don't really want to go down that tangent because it's, you know, when ministers talk confidentially to someone, but he was concerned about his family. We did pray for his family quite often, and we talked about spiritual things sometimes, as a minister would. I remember, if I could just add this, none of you are preachers, but sometimes you start, well, maybe, I don't know. It's a sweeping statement to make, none of you are. You probably all are, I don't know. But I was speaking in a little group meeting on a Sunday morning with that number of people in that one Bible where you sound probably 5 or 6 more. And I got into the message, and I was talking about Joseph. You know, you may know the story. He was in prison and he was released and he became Prime Minister of Egypt under Pharaoh. And as I got into it, I thought, well, what are you doing? These people would all like that and they're never going to be released. But, you know, it's like walking down the gangway where you can't turn around. And when we had coffee afterwards, I remember we talked about it, and I said, you know, Nelson, I feel a bit bad, I'll be honest, talking about Joseph going out of prison and becoming Prime Minister or Head of State. That could be you, and I know that's your heart's desire, not for yourself, but this vision you have for the country living in reconciliation and harmony. And he chuckled, and we talked about it, and that led on to the subject of Joseph being a person of forgiveness. And I'm not trying to sit here this morning and say, when Colin said that, the lights opened and he said, well, I'm going to become a man of forgiveness. But I think it was a journey from, you know, probably, you know, that school that he was at was pretty austere. Those of you that are teachers, there were no ablution blocks at the school. There was pit toilets outside. And in the mornings, 5:30, they'd have to go down the hill to the river to wash in. And sometimes there was snow near Fort Beaufort. And Mandela was a Bible school leader there, a little class leader. And I wonder how often they would have just routinely prayed, you know, the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those that trespass against us. And so I think it was a process in his mind where we've tried the violent route. maybe reconciliation, forgiveness is the right route. And one of his expressions, one of his favourite expressions, which I try and take to myself, and I'll leave with you, there was the one, resentment and bitterness is like you drinking poison and hoping it destroys your enemies. And the other one, which is a very simple one, it always seems impossible until it's done. I think that's a wonderful expression for life. It always seems impossible till it's done. And I think that was his philosophy in prison. Sorry, I've gone off.
No, it's all fascinating. And talk to me about what happened then after the impossible did happen in his case. So he became president, and at that point was meeting world leaders. And I guess you had an insight into his thoughts on world leaders who at the time included Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, people often ask me that question. I think
I did it quite subtly though, didn't
no, you didn't. The question that's usually asked is, because of course when he was released, get my dates right, I've got to be careful here because I tried to be diplomatic once and I said, oh, well, I'm not going to mention any political leader, I'll just pick a name out the air, John Smith. And someone said John Smith was the Labour leader before Tony Blair. I didn't know that, but just I thought John Smith is a neutral name, Smith and John. So I would think that when he was released, John Major was about 93, but the first former international leader that he wanted to meet was Margaret Thatcher. He did ask me a few questions about her because she was a subject of fascination in South Africa, if I could say. And I think in the Xhosa culture, and I think this one needs to understand, you don't have women African chiefs. And you've got this powerful woman. And I think he wanted to sort of just meet her and see what she really liked. That's, but again, he was a people's person, so he wanted to meet a cross-section of people. That's quite a question I often get asked, because you would think, Margaret Thatcher was against sanctions, and you would think that she'd be the last one he'd not meet. And yet, I'm not going into the political realm, but it was good that looking back in hindsight, because South Africa wasn't ready then, but it was ready when he was released. Can I say something on that?
Of course.
Yes, okay. If you knew the situation in South Africa then, South Africa was heading for civil war, of which neither side could win. I mean, the South African Defence Force, of which I was part of in an indirect way, being navigating officer of the ship, I mean, it was hardly going into battle. I think in force for its size was second only at the time, according to one of these Jane's books, to Israel's military. So they would have fought to the dead end, and I say dead end collectively. And it had reached a boiling point where a Syria situation was inevitable. I mean, Syria wasn't around then. But the nation did come to prayer, and P.W. Botha was laid aside, and people thought, well, who would be the best president now? And the money was on Pip Botha, who subsequently joined the ANC from the National Party, because he was known as a verlichter, enlightened. You have these political terms, the wets and the this and the that. You know, newsman. And the worst possible scenario was F.W. de Klerk in people's mind. He was on the extreme right wing of the National Party, more intransigent than P.W. Botha. But F.W. de Klerk won it. But in the meanwhile, an amazing thing happened with F.W. de Klerk. Became a committed Christian, and so you had these two that could find some sort of common ground. And when Nelson Mandela was in Victor Verster prison for his last year or so in prison, he wasn't really in prison then, he was in house arrest on prison property, so technically he was in the prison governor's house. And in fact, that prison governor's house, he used plans of that house to model his house in Qunu, in the Eastern Cape where he's buried. And the house in Qunu is slightly larger, but on the exact plan of the house in Victor Verster prison where he lived. But he was, you know, F.W. de Klerk obviously couldn't be seen to be going into to Victor Verster prison. You could have imagined the newspaper headlines, you know, and Mandela couldn't be seen going to sitting in F.W. de Klerk's car. So he was driven into Cape Town for talks under a blanket, lying on the back seat of the motor car. You may have read that in some of the books and that. And so the talks did start before he was released. But Nelson Mandela was adamant that he didn't want to be released before all the others had been released. So they were all released before him. And he was that type of man. Sorry, I've probably gone too far.
No, I think it's fascinating because we're talking about these different spheres all sort of starting to align. You've got politics and you've got religion and rugby as well became a point at which actually everything did align. It became an opportunity for reconciliation.
Well, you know, some people still say, especially between the Afrikaners, that Rugby World Cup match in South Africa was probably the greatest reconciliation. We had the Peace and Reconciliation Commission, we had the South African flag, all Mandela's ideas. If you look at the South African flag, it's not a mishmash of colours. The green, black and gold are the colours of the freedom fighters, and the red, white and blue are the colonial powers, come together with a V, showing they can come together. The national anthem, Nkosi Sikelel' Africa, is the old freedom fighter hymn. There was their song. Die Stem van Zuid-Afrika became synonymous with apartheid. Of course it wasn't. It came out of Union in 1910 after the Anglo-Boer War, but it became the apartheid. So Mandela said, well, somehow bring the two together. And they said, well, it's impossible because, now I'm as tone-deaf musical, they said, well, you'd have to have a key change in the middle. He said, do it then. So I believe Italy's the only other country musical that has a key change in the middle. So the South African national anthem, I'm going on a political tangent to your question, it's in 5 languages, and the two songs or anthems of each group brought together. The first verse is in Zulu and Xhosa, the second verse is in Sotho, the third verse is Afrikaans, and the last verse is in English. But all those were good reconciliatory things. But that rugby match was amazing because the final was likely to be France and New Zealand because they had a tropical cyclone in Durban. You may have seen the film and read the book. But South Africa would have then not got to the final because they had 1 or 2 less penalties than the French, more penalties than the French. And so they had helicopters over the Kings Park Stadium in Durban to try and dry the field out, and African ladies squeegeeing the field. So the match was played a minute to full time. South Africa's leading 19-16, and whoa, Benazir, the French Algerian, scores a try. But they couldn't give the try. They would already made it 21-19 and without the conversion. I'm getting to your answer. And Benazir went into the dressing room afterwards and said, I wept and wept. It's in his memoirs book. Because I knew I'd scored the try. They didn't have video replays then. But he said, when I saw what it did to healing a nation, I wept even more. And so hats off to Benazir. But anyway, the springbok had become the hated symbol of apartheid for some reason. Kragdadig, there's that word again. South African rugby is always pretty physical. I said to someone before the World Cup match, I feel terribly sorry for Japan because South Africa is so physical, and Japan ended up beating South Africa. And they wanted to get rid of that springer. So what Nelson Mandela does, and you all know the story, he goes to the rugby match, not knowing who he's going to present the Wilbur Webb Ellis Trophy to, dressed in the rugby togs of Francois Pienaar with a springbok cricket cap on his head and a springbok emblazoned on his rugby jersey, the number of Francois Pienaar, and you've got this iconic moment where he presents this trophy dressed as a Springbok rugby player to the captain of the Springboks, 2 in the same rugby togs, and there was no other event that brought that healing to a nation quite like that. And he said, As long as I'm president, the Springbok will always stay the symbol of South African rugby. And that kind of, it was like letting air out of a balloon, because the Afrikaners, although F.W. de Klerk had carried them, they were never too happy with this whole thing. I mean, I'm generalizing, obviously, it wasn't all of them. And it was like taking the pressure out of it. And they said, well, I suppose to use the term, we can do business with this man. He's not as bad as we think. So that was a great reconciliatory movement.
And talk to me about Winnie Mandela as well, because you talk about reconciliation. There is still, as far as I understand it, a huge split in terms of how she's seen, the mother of the nation, but at the same time, back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, put an awful lot of stuff directly at her door. It was pretty unpleasant. What was your experience of that?
Winnie. She blew it 2-3 years ago when she said Nelson was a fraud, and the whole divorce was fraudulent, and to call Mandela a fraud in South Africa, who was regarded almost as a god, something you just don't do, and she was the mother of the nation. I first met Winnie on the ferry going across, and she said how concerned she was with the young youth of South Africa. And there was a wedding on the island. Tutu did it, and I helped Tutu in a way. And of course, Wilton Kwai, who's signed in the book, the Bible, he couldn't go to the reception. The reception was in a congregational hall in Woodstock in Cape Town, and Winnie hosted it. And she was an interesting lady, but she got slowly harder. When Nelson got softer, it's almost hard to explain. And then I noticed that bitterness coming into, and she was hounded by the security police. I'm not just being critical of her. She was in house arrest in Bromford for a while, and then she started making statements. They have this terrible necklacing thing where they put a rubber tie around someone's neck, put petrol in, and set it alight, and agonizing death. And she made that statement with matches and petrol and rubber tires, we'll liberate this country. And it was that whole ugly incident when Stompie Stoffele died in the Mandela Football Club she started. She was sort of charged with murder, man's whatever. But at the same time, Nelson was seeing that reconciliation and peace was the only way to come together, and so they kind of sadly drifted apart. And I didn't personally think the marriage would last that long afterwards, and it didn't. And not that I was prophetic or anything, but I just thought it's going to be really difficult. Having dealt with criminal prisoners as well for 50 years, where one changes and the other doesn't change, either the one inside or outside. And then to try and come together is almost impossible. So I think I'd leave it at that. I think Winnie's a sad case, in a sad situation, and then of course the divorce hit her hard, and I suppose it hits anyone hard. And the fact that he married the widow of another Southern African president, who I think the South African security forces may have had him something to his aeroplane, Samora Machel, because we were backing Renamo and he was Frelimo in the Angolan Civil War. And he was very happy with Grosha, lovely lady. And I think that added to the bitterness of Winnie. They sat together at his funeral, you may have seen it on television, but the clause from Winnie came out shortly. And I'm saddened to say this if it's being recorded and Winnie ever hears it, because I think she was a lovely lady when I first met her.
I'm going to take some questions from you guys in just a sec, but I wanted to finally ask, from your experience of Nelson Mandela, what are the lessons that you think that we can draw as leaders or as people?
I go back to that statement that I made, it always seems impossible until it's done. I think that is a sublime message of, and I would say in any leadership, if you know and you're sure that that is the right way, it might seem impossible, but from Mandela it always seems impossible until it's done. And then I think the other one, maybe leadership in encroaching onto perhaps the more faith side of things, is his statement when he walked out of Victor Verster prison, 27 years as a prisoner in diabolical conditions for the first half of it. I mean, imagine sleeping 14 years on a mat on a concrete floor. He said he knew when I walked out of Victor Verster prison, if I didn't leave all my hatred, bitterness and resentment behind, I'd be walking out of one prison and straight into another, but one of my own making. I suppose, you know, those are all together in a jigsaw of leadership, but I think be real. I think Mandela was real, whether he was with international leaders, with Queen Elizabeth, or with urchins from the street. He was always the same Mandela. And your young man Harry that interviewed me earlier asked me a similar question. I said be real and be sincere, and people pick up that. Always seems impossible until it's done. I can almost see him saying that. Does that help in that question?
Well, it does, absolutely. Yeah. It helps you guys as well. Any questions that you would like to ask before we come to the end of our time together?
We do have one from Periscope.
Oh, well,
do you want to quickly do that before yours? It's only a short one. The one on Periscope was from Paul, and he wants to know what leadership lesson you would give us on forgiveness and reconciliation from your time with Nelson Mandela.
Well, the fact of the matter is, just those two words, forgiveness and reconciliation, can heal a nation bound for civil war. And if we can do that with black on black violence, white on white hatred, English and Afrikaners, black on white, mixed race, not trusting either, if somehow through forgiveness and reconciliation you can bring that mishmash of people together, I think that shows the value of it. How to do it, not sounding like a parrot or an onion repeating myself, it always seems impossible until it's done. But, you know, just before I spoke to, my first talk on Mandela in this country, without a PowerPoint presentation, was to the retired NHS workers in Portsmouth. And I got a frantic email the night before, remember, no religion, no politics. And I sent an email back and I said, well, I'm talking on probably the world's favourite politician, and I was his chaplain. So I'm going to go off that thing. I think sometimes in our own strength, forgiveness is something that is extremely difficult to do. And whether you go the AA route and power greater than I am, or as you would do as a Christian minister myself, in the power of the Lord, whatever. I'm not here to convert you, I'm here just to share and answer questions as I feel to answer. Sometimes to be able to do these things, you need that ability outside of your own strength. But that's my religious bit, if you like. But yes, I think, you know, how do you eat an elephant? Take one bite, chew it and swallow it. How do you forgive? Take one step, chew it and swallow it. And if it doesn't work, take another step. It sometimes is a process. Does that help? But it works every time.
I think that's useful, not just in terms of white, black, but also blue on blue, which is going to take some reconciliation politically.
Yes, that's you can get me between Boris and Dave.
Sort it all out. Yes, you had a question.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to get a bit of an insight into his sense of humour within that time that you were with him.
Initially, I didn't see it that much. Because he didn't know me and I didn't know him, and there were warders around, and it was sort of artificial. But as it got more relaxed, he did have a very subtle sense of humour, and he did have this sort of I want to meet Margaret Thatcher, and then he'd chuckle. as if, why would you think I'd want to meet of humour? And that's all. It wasn't a raucous sense of humour with jokes and that sort of thing, because it was difficult conditions in there. I don't think he was, I don't think even when he was a politician, I'm trying to think, I don't think he came across as a very humorous person. You wouldn't have seen, you'd see him as a serious person dressed in rugby togs, but you wouldn't have seen him as Boris leaning out of the bus with Cornish pasties, that type of thing, if I could, and waving an asparagus thing around. So it wasn't that type of humour, but you know, wouldn't Rudyard Kipling say, if you can walk with kings and something and not lose the common touch? And that was his great thing, that he could be the same with the urchins of the street, or with his opposition. I mean, he went to have, there's a little area of South Africa called Oranje, which is illegal, but they've allowed it. It's up near the desert, near Kalahari, where it's the last bastion of white South Africa. Only whites can live there. But they just cast a line down to it, Oranje. No one want to live there anyway. It's barren, bleak, windswept, desert-like. And Betsy Verwoerd lived there. And Hendrik Verwoerd was the sort of architect of apartheid. Didn't found it, had always been there, but you know, in fact, I think the British built it when they colonized South Africa. But he was the one who made it legal. And shortly after being president, he went by helicopter to have coffee and koeksisters with Betsy Verwoerd. He was that type of president. He went to P.W. Botha in the wilderness, not wilderness, a little town called the Wilderness where P.W. had retired. P.W. didn't want to see him. Mandela wanted to see him as president. He went to visit him, and they got on quite well together. He was that type of, not a humorist, but all peoples, whether it be the Spice Girls or Her Majesty, just the same to everybody. So
how much access did you have to him, or he to you, in your time?
For that time, he had as much access to me as he wanted during the prison times. Obviously,
so he could ask for a meeting with you.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
He obviously couldn't ask to see me at 8 o'clock at night, unless, let's say, when he had died and he wanted to see the chaplain. I'm just using that as a thing. They may have made an exception, but probably said, no, you can see him the next morning, because they were pretty
Do you
hard.
think he used you as a sounding board or for counsel? And the other thing that intrigues me, how did he get information about what was going on in the world while he was in prison? Was it free? Was it there all the time? Or?
Gradually the censorship got less.
Right.
You could see some of the, when they first were allowed newspapers, it was black felt tip pens on it, their letters with felt tip pen through. Prisoners the world over have an amazing way of getting information.
We've just had that problem, haven't we? With drones.
He didn't have drones in those days, but
then,
you know, there were little things just outside the courtyard where Mandela and them exercised. There was the remains of a kind of tennis court thing, and sometimes a tennis ball would go over with a slit in it and a note inside, and the water would keep it and then throw it back. So sometimes the notes would come in the food, and someone would hear something because some had more access to news, like those working in the kitchen may have had a small radio, and they weren't under such security things, and they would get, you know, there were many sort of ways.
So was it you that told him all about Maggie Thatcher?
A little bit.
So is that how he got influence to want to meet her?
I won't take that credit. But by that time, they were getting sort of more information, and he would have, you know, there was a lady politician in South Africa that was a fearless woman, Helen Suzman. I don't know if any of you have heard of Helen Suzman. For 13 years, she stood alone in the House of Parliament with this phalanx of mostly men, very, you know. She was allowed to see him on a few occasions, and slowly information became a little bit more. And then, of course, when the warders, I was out walking on eggs because I was trusted and I didn't want to betray that trust. And because I was trusted, the security things on me were relaxed a little bit, but I never knew if there was a hidden microphone, and I don't think technology was as good as it is now then. But it was sort of walking on eggs, and I mean, I was asked, offered a very great amount of money in some surreptitious way of getting a picture of Mandela in prison. I mean, how on earth would I do that? I would have ended up in jail. And in those days, it would have been a big camera. There wasn't little digital things. And we'd have to take it to the chemist to get the spoon developed. Oh, probably they would have arranged that. In fact, it was from a British tabloid newspaper, but we leave it at that.
British journalists make you proud of that. Can I just take a question from this gentleman behind you? His hand up.
So it seems to me that Mandela's gift in some sense was to recognise and to get other people to recognise similarity, not difference.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
I wonder how that bears on the UK's political situation today, where shortly we're all going to vote on whether we want to belong to other or whether we want to split asunder from other.
What was the question?
So what's your reflection on that? How do you is there a lesson there for us from Mandela's approach to things?
I don't know. You see, the situation is quite a bit different in a sense with respect. There might be the similarity. South Africa was one fractured, divided nation, and he saw the apartheid government decided to have Bantustans, a little semi-independent on unarable areas, and each would run their own affairs. Because I think the natural inclination of people is to split up to your own groupings, Yugoslavia and those recent cases. But he saw that in South Africa it wasn't coming together. We are together. Let's make it work. So as far as the analogies with Europe, I'd be frightened to say, because if I did say, you might. I think I don't know. I'm sorry, I've left it in the air.
I think you're quite a good diplomat to have done that, because we're fascinated at the moment about what great historical figures would have wanted us to vote. Yes?
It's a question. As your association with Mandela increased, did you, and your visibility with him, did you receive any negative pressure from friends, family, or white community?
Oh, yes.
Due to your association with him, how did you deal with that?
Oh, yes. There was a joke newspaper article. I remember the headline of the joke. Skok onthulling, prochkandidaat is vriend van Mandela. That literally translated, and I was never a candidate for politics for the Progressive Party, but they were trying to be mocking, because it was Helen Suzman's party. Shock, revelation, I'm a friend of Mandela's, you see. It was down to, I'm still thinking of the Europe questions, I'll try and answer it later, or when we chat. You know how I'll answer it. I used to say to the church sometimes, Nelson Mandela sends his greetings to you. And at the time, I was asked to stop saying that because it was offending people. And in hindsight, that you think, well, wow, why would it offend people? But you see, Mandela, especially in the white community, was regarded as a terrorist. And there was freedom fights. There was violence on both sides, let's be honest and cut to the chase. And I link that when people are surprised. It would be like me going to a group in this country and saying to a church, I've just been to Belmarsh prison and Abu Qatada sends his greetings. I can say him because he's been deported to Jordan. I think that would have offended certain people. And so there was that. I used to always have, if he's ever released, you'll see he's not like you think he is. And even my late father, I used to always, I stopped after a while because I didn't want to give Dad a heart attack at the time. I used to say, Mr. Mandela sends his best wishes to you. I'm very terrible, you know. But I'm so glad, I used to say, Dad, but, you know, he's not like you see he is. And I'm so glad that my father lived to see and became actually quite, I don't want to use the word fan, it sounds a bit trite because he wasn't a fan, admirer of Nelson Mandela. So there was that animosity at the